What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 76, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Joining me today is Pat McFarlane. Pat, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back on the show, man.
Excited to have you back on. Me and Pat have done a good amount of shows. He was on Foreign Policy Focus a couple times. I've been on his show, Liberty Weekly, a couple times, and I mean, we just done a lot of great stuff together. So I'm really excited for this one because we're I think your most controversial show. We're talking about the same topic here today. Both mine and Pat's show can be found at the Libertarian Institute, and it's important to talk about the Libertarian Institute right now because we've got our annual fundraiser going on. We're well over halfway to our goal so far this year. Scott has some great kitbats, a digital book, a physical book for $50, and he will sign it for you. So that's Fool's Errand, Enough Already, or The Great Ron Paul. There's other kitbats too. For $100, you'll get the lifetime subscription to Listen and Think Audio. For $200, you'll get this really awesome Ron Paul copper coin. And then you could get everything for $500. So support the Institute. I've talked so far, when talking about the fundraiser, how the Institute was great in giving me a platform when basically I was just a libertarian posting on my blog. I started from Tom Woods' Bluehost link. Scott Horton picked up both my daily news roundup and then my old show, Foreign Policy Focus, and put it on his Institute. And that really elevated the number of people are looking and listening to my stuff, and has really fueled everything that I've done. And now as well as being the news editor at the Libertarian Institute, I'm also the assistant editor at antiwar.com. So it's been great for me. Pat, talk a little bit about the Libertarian Institute.
Oh, yeah. I am definitely incredibly grateful to Scott for allowing me to post my content on the Libertarian Institute. It's the best moment for me was when I started posting there and I logged into the site for one of the first times and I saw a column written by Ron Paul that was scheduled to be published a day later. And I'm sure Ron didn't post that or schedule it on the website, but it was very cool to be published on a website that was also publishing his work. So very glad to that. It's a tax deductible donation, so you'd be starving the war state with your tax dollars if you donate to the institute. And there's awesome kickbacks as well. So I've donated myself. I would encourage my listeners to do so.
All right. Well, thanks, Pat. And then just a couple other things to mention here. Follow both mine and Pat's work on YouTube. We both do video versions of our show. We put a lot of work into that. So again, Liberty Weekly or Conflicts of Interest. And then follow me on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _. Pat, where are you on Twitter?
It's Liberty_Weekly. It used to be just Liberty Weekly, but then someone took that. So,
all right. And then the last thing I'll mention is to support the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com sells CBD products. They're great lab tested products. Right now, they're running their special on CBD extract with melatonin. Will Porter, the co-host of the show, who struggles with a little bit of insomnia, says that's helped him to fall asleep. So if you're somebody who needs to help get to sleep at night, check out that. You get buy one get one free. You can also use the promo code PEACE when you check out, and you'll get 25% off orders of $75 or more. So again, promo code PEACE at PalomaVerdeStore.com. Pat, let's get into the content. A big story today. You caught some heat for a recent show you did. You broke down a video from, was it the Tim Dillon IRL show?
it was Tim Pool
Tim
IRL
Pool,
pop.
that's right. Yeah. And then him and a co-host of his who's a libertarian. I've really never watched the show myself, but I do see a lot of his clips on Twitter. I see a lot of libertarians sharing his work. I know libertarians have gone on there and have had great conversations with the guy. And a lot of times when I see his work, it seems like he's fairly on point. He definitely doesn't buy into a lot of mainstream media narratives. My guess is that he wouldn't have bought like chemical weapons in Syria or something like that. But you caught these guys buying into some real war propaganda. So I don't know. Set it up however you feel like you need to here, Pat.
Yeah, so for the audience who's not familiar with Tim Pool's work and Luke Rudkowski, Luke actually publishes under We Are Change is his organization, and both of them kind of started with, they were embedded reporters. So Luke has done confrontation videos with a bunch of elites on Wall Street. Um, I can think of like Rothschild he's confronted, Dick Cheney, I believe, and just a bunch of these really bad people. And he's done like the Bilderberg Group and that kind of stuff. Tim Pool got famous at Occupy Wall Street because he was actually, I think, homeless for a while, and then he started filming everything. And so he got hired by Vice, and he was working there, and then he left Vice and started his own thing. So some of the pushback I got is because I was too nice to Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski. Luke is an ANCAP. I mean, he's an anarchist capitalist, and Tim Pool is kind of a milquetoast fence sitter centrist type, but he has libertarian instincts. So they're both professedly anti-war. But what really concerned me, and one thing that we've been seeing all over the place, is this anti-China rhetoric and propaganda. And there's a certain rule, and I'm not sure what it's called, but it's don't attribute to malice what could easily be explained by incompetence. And I'm not saying that they're incompetent by any means. There I am giving them the benefit of the doubt. However, this whole narrative of Uyghur genocide occurring in China is very suspect. And Gareth Porter and Max Blumenthal just had a great article diving deeper into one of the study that a lot of these claims of Uyghur genocide is based off of. It all seems to come from one very far right extreme source. And
Right.
so I think we'll get in there, but if you'll indulge me a bit, Kyle, I wanted to get in.
Can I
Go.
just mention one more thing? One of the
Yeah,
reasons,
go ahead.
even though I don't listen to Tim Pool or really know who this guy is or his co-host, that I wanted to hit on this topic is because just scrolling through my Facebook news feed or my Twitter feed, which is mostly libertarians or other independent media types. Some people who definitely aren't libertarians, like a Scott Adams, but is definitely not establishment media and definitely has some influence in libertarian circles. Cernovich and Japosibic, again, not libertarians, but definitely not mainstream media. But even, like people with, I see you have like a Libertarian Party Mises Caucus banner will share a thing saying that Joe Biden wasn't harsh enough on China for the genocide they're carrying out against the Uyghurs. And one of the things I think it is a case that I see a lot with like Cuba and Venezuela as well, where if people in Venezuela are starving to death, libertarians are quick to go, oh, the stupid communist. And yeah, communists are stupid, but there's also U.S. economic war on that country, and depriving them of being able to get parts for their generators and stuff is, according to one CEPR, Center for Economic Policy Research study by I believe Jeffrey Satz, they say about 40,000 people, additionally in Venezuela, their deaths are in part contributable to the U.S. sanctions. So just because there's communism doesn't necessarily mean that it's Mao's year zero going on. It's not Joseph Stalin. Not that this is a system that I want to live over or I really want to defend, but that also doesn't mean that you could just accept whatever extreme radical claim that any warhawk makes about China, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. So that's why I thought was important. But go ahead, Pat.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, these claims, and let's just dive into exactly what these folks are saying. I know that you have some things. I played a clip in my show, my episode on this, but it is the craziest stuff. I mean, it is rape, it is sterilizations, it is mass genocide, it's organ harvesting. I mean, anything that you can think of, the most outlandish claims are being leveled against the Chinese Communist Party, and they're saying they're performing this against the Uyghurs. So let's take a look at this.
say something like that.
Well, his words were very important because it was almost as he was excusing the activities. He was talking about China's history. Whenever China wasn't united, they were attacked from the outside. And he talked about how this is the cultural norms. Well, if it's your cultural norm to strip down and have men forced on women, to have forced sterilization camps, internment camps, I'm trying to watch my words here.
Unrequested insemination.
Yes, that's one way that we could say it. If we're going to have something like that excused as a culture, that's absolutely inexcusable, and it's extremely dangerous, not just for the Uyghur Muslims, but for all the other people that are going to be under the Chinese umbrella. And because of the Belt and Road Initiative, because of China's goal to become the #1 hegemonic power, a lot of people are going to be subjugated under China in the near future.
What you just said, Jack. What did you
I said that Joe Biden neutered American exceptionalism.
No.
Oh.
I'm talking
unrequested insemination?
Women are being held down. So this news broke. A witness came out and said that her job in the camps was to basically pin the women down while the men came in.
Take their clothes off, and then, this was reported by the BBC,
force
by the way.
themselves upon them.
Yeah.
We also got numerous reports that many of the women who, on their own, of their own volition, became pregnant, had the Chinese government paramilitary forcefully end those pregnancies.
So they're
forcefully sterilize.
They're trying to sterilize the Uyghur population, but force the Han genetic code into other Uyghur women?
Yes.
There's also videos of children being taken away from their parents and then being told to repeat that the Chinese government, the Chinese state, the Chinese country is their mother now. So what's happening right now, especially with some of the drone footage that's been leaked of individuals being hooded and put on trains, is absolutely terrifying, especially when you see the larger response, especially when you see on Twitter an embassy from the Chinese government officially say that it's women's rights that they're promoting, women's equality and women's freedom when they have these forced sterilizations on them. That's the kind of like crazy, insane, woke language that they're trying to use to justify this. And you just saw Joe Biden usher and utter CCP, Chinese Communist Party talking points to the American public like it was normal.
Where did he get the talking points from?
I'll say two things. The first thing is we had China Uncensored on the show.
Yes.
So Pat, I'll pick up with the China Uncensored stuff in a minute, but there was a lot there that I want to hit on and ask your thoughts on it and everything like that. I guess one of the first things to say is that what they're talking about here is Joe Biden at a town hall was confronted on this, and rather than saying that the Chinese government does some terrible stuff, but we can't engage in threat inflation or something realistic, he's mumbled around and said something about, well, the culture's different, and that's certainly a stupid thing to say, and I just want to put out that me and you have no intention of defending Joe Biden's statement or anything like that. This is just about getting to the reality and the truth of the situation. Not that either of us think, oh, we should go live in China, communist China, then we'll be happy and free and rich and won't end up in one of these prison camps or something like that. So go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, this was a town hall event that Joe Biden did in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think last week, Wednesday or Tuesday, something like that. Yeah, and neither do we want to defend the Communist Party. It's really about the Chinese Communist Party. It's really about getting to the truth of this matter and knowing that. I don't know about you, Kyle, but I can't think of any claim that could be worse than what is being alleged that the Chinese Communist Party is doing. I mean, I have a Cannibal Corpse T-shirt on right now, so my imagination could go off into all different directions. But when you think about the things that are most offensive to the human morality and human condition, I can't think of much that's worse than this.
No, absolutely not. Well, they're claiming that essentially China is doing the worst thing you could do to an ethnic group of people, which is, you kill anyone who won't comply, and then you basically force everybody else to assimilate or accept their status as like a lower class. And, these kinds of terrible acts have occurred, in sense over, the course of human history. But it does seem like they're really throwing everything at the wall here. It's not like in Saudi Arabia or in Yemen where they're dropping bombs on the population and starving them, but at the same time the Saudi soldiers aren't breaking into the capital city, holding the women down and raping them, which they also include here. So they really roll they're killing them, they're raping them, they're re-educating the kids, they're doing all this terrible stuff, and not that some of these things may kind of be true, but they're saying that all of them, and they're accepting the interpretation that all of these things are definitely happening.
For sure. And immediately there were a few parallels that came to mind of proven false situations that things like these have been alleged. I mean, Gaddafi giving his soldiers Viagra to help rape women, the Incubator baby story in the first Gulf War. the Kuwaiti Incubator baby story, where it turns out, again, that was eyewitness testimony. I'm saying in quotes, eyewitness testimony of soldiers coming in and throwing babies on the ground and letting them die there.
Well,
And,
say an eyewitness, quote unquote eyewitness, came before Congress and
Right.
performed a lie, and like, a tear jerking, I witnessed this horrible thing, soldiers killing the most innocent thing in the world, a baby in an incubator. Like, you can't do something worse than to a baby in an incubator. Did nothing to anyone. Right? Like, you can't say the baby was asking for it in any sense of the word, couldn't have looked at somebody the wrong way, nothing. And that's what she said happened, completely untrue. Made it all up. Actor.
Right. And it turns out that she was the daughter of, was it the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait?
No, the other way around.
Oh, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it shouldn't have even taken that much skepticism, or didn't somebody in Congress say wait, this is the ambassadors? They had to have met the ambassador, right? I don't know. You would imagine that somebody would have recognized her from the picture on the desk. I don't know how that works.
And there was a PR firm that was involved as well, some kind of a coaching PR firm that was involved. So there's parallels all up and down history where the most horrible atrocities have been peddled to push war and to start war and to further propagate war. And I wanted to start off, I was doing a piece on World War I, and the immediate parallel came to my mind was how World War I was encouraged by the British press and the British Empire. So after the war happened about 10 years later, Arthur Ponsonby, who was he was one of the MPs in the British Parliament, he came out with this famous piece called Falsehood in Wartime that we see on the screen here. And in it he detailed and debunked all of the war propaganda that was pushed by the British government. He describes that a certain branch of the British government was created to create war propaganda. And I just want to read a little bit about what he says. He says, lying, as we all know, does not take place only in wartime. Man, it has been said, is not a veridical animal, but his habit of lying is not nearly so extraordinary as his amazing readiness to believe. It is indeed because of human credulity that lies flourish. But in wartime, the authoritative organization of lying is not sufficiently recognized. The deception of whole peoples is not a matter which can be lightly regarded. A useful purpose can therefore be served in the interval of so-called peace by a warning which people can examine with dispassionate calm, that the authorities in each country do, and indeed must, resort to this practice in order first to justify themselves by depicting the enemy as an undiluted criminal, and secondly to inflame popular passion sufficiently to secure recruits for the continuance of the struggle. They cannot afford to tell the truth. In some cases, it must be admitted that at the moment they do not even know what the truth is, and I think this might be an instance of it. He goes further. The unthinking mass accept them, and by their excitement sway the rest. The amount of rubbish and humbug that pass under the name of patriotism in wartime in all countries is sufficient to make decent people blush when they are subsequently disillusioned. So I can think of so many situations, Kyle, where the truth comes out later on that, oh, well, those weapons of mass destruction, yeah, they never existed. Or if they ever did exist, well, we sold them to Saddam. Or I'm thinking about the Douma chemical attack that was debunked subsequently.
Can we hit on the chemical or the nuclear weapons one real quick? Because I think that is one of those things to add to that. What they do is they set it up that we can't wait for the truth to come out because, as Bush said, the truth could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. So here again, I think if me or you advocate to wait till the truth comes out, they would say, well, people are dying right now. So what are you going to do? Sacrifice an entire generation unless this genocide happened while you do work or something like that? Are you the allies in the lead up to World War II just turning back the boats full of Jewish Germans looking to flee the country? Or that's how far they go, and that's what they point to, is that you must be some kind of real villain because you don't support the most extreme interpretation, and that's what we have to base all of our policy and actions on.
And let's talk about some of the worst interpretations from World War One. Some of them was there were stories that came all and spread all throughout Great Britain of the Germans as they marched through Belgium, chopping the hands off of babies in Belgium and France, and that there were scores and scores of babies and young children out there who were missing their hands. These stories were reported in the London Times. They were reported in all the major newspapers in Great Britain, and none of it was true. After the war, the British Parliament sent over emissaries to go through Belgium and France to find examples of these children without hands so that they could help support them. And they couldn't find any. They couldn't find any kids that were missing their hands. There was another story, babies on bayonets. This was put all over in posters in Great Britain to portray the Germans as Huns and brutes. And another story was the story of the mutilated nurse. There was a story that went through northern England of a nurse who had returned from France. Or no, sorry, it was the sister of a nurse who got a letter from her sister in Belgium sent back to Great Britain, talking about how the sender of the letter, the sister, the nurse in Belgium, had had her breast removed and cut off by German soldiers and that they had left her to die, that she was mutilated. It turns out this was a completely false, fabricated story, and the sister who claimed to get this letter was actually lied about it all and was prosecuted. Another thing that happened was that probably the most egregious story that came out and spread through Great Britain was that Germans were literally boiling the corpses of their dead soldiers to distill it down to glycerin to make munitions and bombs with. And this was also reported in the London Times. And of course, this was all reported by people who had knowledges. This was eyewitness testimony. And it turned out that none of it was substantiated. So when you're thinking about some of the worst stories that could be propagated and taken as truth, while boiling down the fat of dead bodies and civilians to make munitions, that's pretty grim.
Right. One of the reasons it's so important to talk about the history of war propaganda and how it's been reported by the most mainstream outlets and believed widely is because it always seems hard for people to believe that it's happened, even if it just happened. So even if, they lied about the 2013 chemical weapons attack in Syria and Eastern Ghouta, if they then lied about the one in Khan Sheikhoun and then a year later in Duma, that doesn't mean that they're not lying about this, but that's kind of what people go to. And I highlight that the Japosibit, Cernovich's type believe all this hostile rhetoric on China, but also all the countries of the world seem to. Even the Dutch parliament voted that what's happening to the Uyghurs is a genocide. I think I saw a similar story about Canada. Pretty much anybody who's right-ish wing and, political is pretty hostile. Let's see, Breitbart is calling Biden China Joe. I think I have a video here from Sagar of the Morning Rising team saying that the CCP is going to control Joe Biden. So it's reported from every corner and even from mainstream outlets, and yet the war propaganda isn't true. So just establishing that, I always think is so important. But let's talk specifically about the claims in that video that they're committing a genocide.
Yeah, and so one of the main things that came out was I referred to that article that came out by Gareth Porter and Max Blumenthal. And essentially what they do is they trace all of these claims of genocide to this one, I think he's a German religious far-right extremist, Adrian Zenz. And there's a report that he came out with claiming genocide, where he basically talks about how the population growth of the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang province has gone down precipitously. And what Gareth Porter does, and I'll tag you in a bit, Kyle, here, but basically what Gareth Porter does is says that, well, there's several things that explain why this a decrease in the population rate it could be happening. And one of them is more proper access to birth control. And so there's a pretty I don't want to say there's a mundane explanation for this that's not genocide. So anything to add to that, Kyle?
Yeah, so to maybe get into the weeds a little bit more on that, he's taking specific data on birth rate and looking at, I guess, like the Uyghur birth rate over its number of years, and found that it went down an awful lot in recent years. I think, like, especially starting in 2015. And so I mean, that could be a sign of, some kind of trouble. That's definitely a statistic worth exploring. But rather than just jumping to the conclusion of genocide, Gareth Porter and Matt Blumenthal actually go through and and break it down. There's also a quote in here from somebody I want to highlight real quick. That is Lyle Goldstein. He works at the Naval War College and is very good on these issues. And he says that the idea of democratic genocide is ridiculous to the point of being insulting to those who lost relatives in the Holocaust, saying that this definitely isn't a genocide. But to get back to the actual policy and data that drove the change in the birth rate for the Uyghurs, is everybody, I think, is familiar with that China has long had policies that dictate the birth rate of their citizens. And apparently that this policy has never really applied to the Uyghurs. For a long time, and the policy in China is apparently loose. Like, if you have a girl as your first kid, I think you're more likely to get permission to have a second kid. Whereas if you have a boy as your first kid, then I think you're gonna have more trouble having a second kid. And I'm sure, look, it's a communist system. It's corrupt as hell. If you're a Communist Party member, you're high ranking, your wife really wants to pop out 8 kids, I bet you could get permission to do that. But as a general rule, there's 1 billion plus people in China. Most people probably are forced into these extremely repressive, including the majority Han's Chinese policies that limit the number of kids that they had. Well, apparently the Uyghurs never were really held to that policy until 2015. And in 2015, I believe they only limit the Uyghurs to 3 kids. That was always the rule that they were supposed to have, but they had never followed it. And so while it looks like there's a huge drop off in birth rate in the Uyghur population, which there isn't. It isn't like they're being limited to having fewer kids than the Han or the other Chinese are able to have. So I think that's a really important part of this, is that it's a really awful policy. Pat, I'm sure you would be 100% against having any kind of central government policy that dictates the rule for 1.3 billion people, saying how many children people are supposed to have. But that is a part of it. Another thing is I think, just as a general human trend, as wealth increases and as access to birth control increases, the birth rate decreases. And so this is another thing that happened at this time. The Chinese government introduced and allowed more access to birth control in the area. And in some senses, like, if we were talking about Venezuela here and brought up access to birth control, I think the pro-regime and establishment types who would believe what's happening in China 100-fold would say that in Venezuela, women aren't having as much access to birth control, and it's limiting their opportunities in life. And whereas they're not bringing up this point here, that if a woman has access to birth control, then she could have more say, or hopefully have more say over when she becomes pregnant, giving her, if you don't have a kid until 25, it could let you advance your career a little bit more, stuff like that. So, these are the kind of things that are actually happening in China that explains, what's happening. Now, there certainly are, like, prison camps in Xinjiang, and even people who have, given statements that aren't, I was held down and raped, talk about how if they, did things that they weren't supposed to do according to the Chinese Communist Party and that culture, they were sent to, like, a re-education camp for a couple weeks. They weren't raped there, but that still isn't the kind of thing that you want happening to a population. So That from the best I could tell is kind of what's happening. Pat, did I miss any details there?
I think there was also reason, and I was listening to Scott Horton's recent interview with Gareth Porter about this article, and I believe Gareth was saying that he found evidence to suggest that some of the people that were in these camps were actually there voluntarily, and that it was a work camp, that their situation, in the rural countryside wasn't. It was more advantageous for them to go there for a period of time and to work and to send the funds back to their family. The other thing that Gareth Porter mentions in this article, which I don't find quite as convincing, just personally, but he really attacks the character of this Adrian Zenz and bases that upon the fact that Zenz he's a Christian fundamentalist who has said that he's led by God to defeat the Communist Party of China. Okay, it depends on, are you Christian or whatnot, but his motives are suspect there. I think, he's kind of poisoned the well a little bit with his own ethos. Does that matter to you, Kyle?
Well, I guess it could if it was his opinion, but his data is enough to like that. I felt that way. Like his data was enough to really convince me. And so that helps to explain, in a sense to me, how he got to this point where he's like producing this and drawing these kind of conclusions. The only thing that part did for me is, it should be a red flag though. This guy is clearly an ideologue and he has a kind of zealous, reason for the message that he's, giving out. And so that makes me more skeptical of what he's saying. And I think, probably like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, when, he was Secretary of State, should have looked at this report and gone, oh boy, wow, what, there's a genocide going on in China. That was his immediate conclusion, right away. He was like, yep, that's it. So, obviously, there's been a lot of people who believe the report from this guy. If you really believe his report, I think you should probably, have an idea of who you're dealing with.
Right. Yeah. Well, Porter goes on, and Blumenthal, they go on at the end. He says, mainstream Western outlets like the AP, BBC, and CNN have accepted Zenz's dubious research as absolute fact, while ignoring his background as a religious extremist who is ideologically committed to regime change in Beijing. And I guess more than him being some kind of Christian fundamentalist, Porter and Blumenthal make the claim that Zenz is also employed by the Jamestown Foundation, which is a neoconservative think tank in Washington, D.C., founded as the outcome of efforts by Ronald Reagan's CIA director, William J. Casey, to establish an extra-governmental channel to pay Soviet dissidents. In the past, the same Jamestown leadership has spearheaded lobbying efforts to support separatism in Chechnya. So, I mean, that's kind of that's a damning link right there.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think, even more so than the Christian part, or the far right label or whatever. All that is, this is obviously more important. If you're employed by a neocon think tank, they often take money from the weapons makers. And let me tell you something, China is big money for weapons makers, man. All the ships and planes and personnel you would need to invade a country of 1.3 billion that size with nuclear weapons certainly is just a huge amount of dollars for the military industrial complex. And I'm sure the Jamestown Foundation gets its fair share of that money coming back around in the cycle.
Yeah. And I think the last thing to note is just that Zenz, in one point, to prove these statistics that he's mentioning, he cites to his own work in a paper that he wrote and authored, and that research doesn't actually say what he says it's saying. So definitely interesting there. But the next thing, Kyle, is we have Moon of Alabama talking more in depth about these Uyghur witnesses.
Right, and I have that article up here, titled why do these Uyghur witnesses stories constantly change? And this is a topic that Moon of Alabama is pretty sharp on, because a similar thing tends to happen with North Korean defectors, where their initial stories of what was happening in North Korea, while disturbing, are nowhere near the very sensational, like gang rape, mass prison camp stories that end up coming out years later. So go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, well, I mean, with these, this article specifically addresses two specific, I believe they're both women, and address their claims. Saria Gul Bay is one of them, and her story completely changes over time. In early interviews, she claimed to have been an instructor working in a re-education camp. Then later, she changed her story and says that she was a detainee. In recent interviews, she claims that she had seen torture and violence in the camps, but she didn't mention these in earlier interviews and had refuted those claims, saying that the only bad thing to happen was urinary problems. Actually, that was a different witness. I apologize. But so in another story, she claims to have observed mass rape. In older interviews, she insisted that she had observed no violence at all. While she now claims that detainees in the camp were forced to eat pork, they are Muslims. She had earlier claimed that no meat was served in the camps at all. And let me tell you, just anecdotally, as my work, I'm a lawyer. I'm admitted to practice in the state of Wisconsin. I've litigated in court before. In law school, they teach you, especially with wrongful convictions, that eyewitness testimony is the least reliable form of evidence. In fact, it's often wrong, and eyewitness testimony is responsible for a lot of wrongful convictions, and it's later overturned with DNA evidence. So, ironically enough, especially with South Bay and this other witness turns when their stories change is after they have confronted certain special interest groups in Western nations, specifically in Sweden, and there was another one in Turkey that have links to U.S. and other funding by the U.S. and other Western nations.
Yeah, that is a tendency to happen. The same thing with the in North Korea. It's often after they get in touch with the defector groups that their stories seem to change and sensationalize. Just on the eyewitness testimony being unreliable, I always like to make this plug. There's two shows on Netflix, Exhibit A and The Confession Tapes. Both are produced by this lady, Samantha Culp, and they are absolutely fantastic on just all the problems with different, forms of evidence and the different issues with the different kind of evidence, but including eyewitness testimony and how many people have been wrongly convicted on that. Pat, I know there was another, maybe continue with this video clip real quick, because I think there was another part of it, in another part of Tim Pool's, somebody he's been interviewing that has some interesting connections. So I'll go ahead and continue this clip.
And they said this. The Biden administration has people involved that like what China is doing in terms of their expansion and have praised them. Now, I want to read you what Biden said. They say, here's a quote. Let's read the quote. I point out to him, I'm assuming this is Xi Jinping, no American president can be sustained as a president if he doesn't reflect the values of the United States. The U.S. president continued. And so the idea that I am not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong, what he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China and Taiwan, trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful. Xi gets it. Culturally, there are different norms that each country and their leaders are expected to follow. The norms in China, as shown in a recent BBC News expose, include systemic torture and, as we mentioned, women being held down and men, coming in and forcing themselves in these concentration camps. Following the release of the BBC report, China banned the outlet in its territory.
Wow.
Because it is happening.
Yeah, there's also a new rule in China where bloggers have to get a government-approved license and credential to talk about politics and foreign policy, but you could still talk about entertainment, food, and beverage.
So, to kind of push on that.
All right, Pat, that group he was talking about, he has interviewed somebody from a China podcast. I know you've been looking into those guys. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, so Luke Rudkowski had China Uncensored on his show on We Are Change. He also had or Tim Pool in the IRL podcast had China Uncensored on. And when I went down the research rabbit hole a little bit, I've uncovered that Falun Gong is the name of a religious extremist cult in China that's being persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. And in the Gray Zone and in other outlets, admittedly, it was NBC posted an article rather about how the Epoch Times and NTD, which is an alternative news outlet, similar vein. I think NTD stands for New Tsang Dynasty, but it's a media outlet that was created by defectors from communist China who belong to this Falun Gong cult. Now they call it a cult. I don't know if it's a cult or not, but it's kind of a UFO-based New Age. It seems New Age to me. It has roots in Buddhism. However, the NDT, the Epoch Times, have received funding from members and are run by members of this Falun Gong cult or organization. And if you recall, the Epoch Times kind of emerged out of nowhere, it seemed like, during the Trump campaign. They started plastering ads all over Facebook and on YouTube. And the Epoch Times, they position themselves as being kind of another Trump outlet, but a lot of anti-China propaganda, frankly, came from there, especially about the origins of the coronavirus as well. And so we were able to link this, and we'll put our links in the show notes page here. Admittedly, I don't always trust NBC, but they had they did a deep dive investigative reporting about the origins of the Epoch Times, and it linked back to the Falun Gong cult. NTD has also been linked there, and oddly enough, also linked there was this China Uncensored YouTube channel. And one of the biggest things about this is that there's Chris Chappell. I believe he's an American, but he is a member of this YouTube channel, China Uncensored, and he specifically appeared in Luke Rudkowski's video, We Are Change video, about just talking about how awful China is and how it's a big threat to the United States. This Chris Chappell has appeared on NTD. He's spoken about the Falun Gong cult on his channel. He has praised the cult on his channel, tried to explain away his relationship to the Falun Gong cult. And so all these things are, these news reportings are being pushed by biased sources. It's alarming to me that Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski would be associated with this Falun Gong cult or people that have ties to it. So it's just concerning to me. And we'll support all these this investigative research with the links in the show notes page, but this is where a lot of these claims are coming from.
Right. Yeah. I remember when the Epoch Times or the Epoch Times first showed up on YouTube, and I was getting hammered every video I was watching. It was like and they did like a lot. They had a few exposés into Russiagate, and they definitely weren't Russiagaters, but like a lot of their Russiagate coverage was pretty questionable. Somebody compared it once to a kind of a Chinese New York Post, a dissident Chinese New York Post, and that seems about right to me. Like they're I'm sure they've done real journalism before, but a lot of it is pretty suspect and questionable. But they have a huge reach in U.S. and especially I think in Trump circles. Not that that's necessarily where like Tim Pool is or something like that, but they do seem to get a lot of buy-in from the Breitbart crowd and stuff like that. So and I guess it's not so much that they interview these Chinese China Uncensored guys, but it seems like they bought into a lot of the claims and are just repeating a lot of the claims. That seems really questionable and suspect to me. So Pat, what else do we have? I know that you caught a lot of heat when you made your video on this. So where, what are there any other things that like people like maybe a good criticism they made that you want to respond to or anything like that?
Honestly, I try really hard not to straw man people, especially when they're arguing against me. But a lot of it was we already addressed. A lot of it was, oh well, what do you say about the people who, these eyewitnesses and the people who have gone in front of tribunals and testified to Congress, things like that. And frankly, it's we've addressed it. People lie. People have lied in the past. They've done it to propagate war. They've done it in congressional testimony. They do it in court testimony constantly. And so that's the major thing. I mean, otherwise people being like, oh, you're just cucking for China or, F China or Beijing Biden kind of stuff, and that really doesn't bother me. It's like, well, I, I'm not infallible. I'm trying to look at the facts. I don't condone any genocide that's happening. I don't condone the Chinese Communist Party, but I don't want anyone to go and fight and die over false allegations primarily. But you get into all those kind of things and the morality of war, and if a genocide is occurring, what's the appropriate stance that the U.S. should take, or what's the appropriate stance that we as American citizens or as anti-war activists should take. Obviously, a hot war is not something that we want, and I fear that this rhetoric is driving us further and further down that path, or to some kind of fifth generational warfare. We might very well be in a war with China right now. And in fact, that's what Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski say, is that we're already in a fifth generational war with China. It's concerning. I hope that's not true. I don't know what to do with that rhetoric.
Well, I feel like in a sense it is, but it isn't, because when people say you're at war with China or something like that, there's a sense where that's because it has to be that way, or both sides are involved. But look, the U.S. called off its tariff and trade war against China and stopped sailing U.S. warships through the Taiwan Strait and around the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. Then I don't see really a whole lot of cause for conflict. Not that there's not going to be any, disagreements or discrepancies. It's not like the U.S. can't complain about human rights violations in China, and that wouldn't be the worst thing if there wasn't all this other hostile stuff going on either. Not that I necessarily want to encourage it or anything. I tend to not, stick to Dan McAdams' principle here dogmatically, but in general, don't do the war hawks effort for them. Don't do their bidding. Don't push, their lies and their negative claims about other countries for them, because there's enough people in the mainstream media that do that anyways. A couple of reasons I find this topic so important, Pat, is because a lot of the rhetoric about Biden and China reminds me a lot of the rhetoric about Trump and Russia, and basically saying that Biden only says this because he's in the pocket of China, and it's not like, oh, maybe Biden is trying to parse the fact that there is a nasty communist government in China and that they do oppress their people, with the fact that it's not as bad as the genocide claims that there are, and so to not create undue political pressure on Joe Biden to be hostile towards China, I think is important, especially because the trade war with China has already cost the U.S. up to 250,000 jobs, and while it could, if we get rid of it, we could add 145,000 jobs by 2025. There was a report by the U.S. China Business Council that found that the trade war, if it continues for another 5 years, could cost the U.S. 750,000 jobs. And so it's a really dangerous kind of policy to pursue. China set out a call to reset relations with the U.S., but the U.S. rebuffed that and said they're just trying to avert blame. The Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, has said that the trade war with China is going to continue. NATO has said that they are seeing the rise of China as a defining issue for the alliance. And so there's so much hostility already being poured into the U.S.-China relationship, Pat, that we really don't need to push Joe Biden to feel like he has to be more aggressive against that country. Anything else on this issue, Pat?
Yeah, you made a great point. I thought it was a great point that the rhetoric against Biden is very reminiscent of the Trump-Russia rhetoric. How come is it that we never see a president being accused of being too much in France's pocket, or too much in Germany's pocket or something like that? Of the two nations, out of how many nations are in the world, like 280 or something, of the two nations that our presidents are being accused of being in the pocket of, it's Russia and China.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people point out that the whole Russiagate thing would have been more appropriate titled Israelgate, because in fact, the call that Mike Flynn made to the Russian ambassador that kicked off and started so much of the trouble was actually at the behest of Israel. And so there's so many other countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, again, France is trying to push the U.S. into more conflict in Mali and in North Africa, that you could say are really, endangering Americans by the U.S. being influenced by them. Russia and China really aren't those countries. Pat, before we wrap here, we had a breaking news story today. I'll publish this podcast tomorrow, Friday the 26th, but here Thursday the 24th, pretty late in the afternoon, I would guess about like 6 or 7 Eastern time, we got this breaking story. Will Porter put together a thread, and me and will of course talk about this more, and have more details and fallout. Again, this is pretty breaking. But Idris Ali, who is the Reuters Pentagon reporter, said the U.S. has carried out airstrikes against structures belonging to Iranian-backed militias in Syria. And then we had reporting also from CBS, NBC. Will Porter pointed out that the U.S. Said that the attack was in response to 3 rocket attacks that occurred in Iraq in the past week. One killed a U.S. contractor at a base in Erbil, near the Erbil airport. Another one hit a base that houses U.S. contractors. And then another rocket attack had rockets landing in the Iraqi Green Zone. And the State Department claim is that those rockets were made in Iran. I'm very skeptical of that, just because it's so easy to make these kind of rockets absolutely anywhere. I don't think they would necessarily need to make them in Iran and bring them to Iraq. But they claim that the attacks were carried out by Shia militias. The U.S. always says that the Shia militias are backed by Iran, but what they imply is that they're acting at the behest of Iran, when in reality, I think they have similar positions oftentimes, and a desire like Iran to see the U.S. exit Iraq, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily acting at the behest of Iran as implied. But nonetheless, we end up with airstrikes. I'm not sure how many. It seems that the even Pentagon now that Will says confirmed the strikes. The Pentagon said the strikes destroyed multiple facilities located at the border control point used by a number of Iranian-backed militant groups, including Khabib Hezbollah, said John Kirby. And so again, if they destroy multiple facilities, you'd assume multiple airstrikes. Me and Will, I'm sure, will get into the logistics of the attack, whose airspace they used, how many people were killed, why they chose these targets. But I did want to talk about, because there could be retaliation, escalation over the weekend from the Shia militias acting in Iraq. Another interesting part here is that while the rocket attacks occurred in Iraq, the U.S. response was in Syria, and of course, the Shia militias fight ISIS on both sides of the border, where the U.S. only fights the Shia militias on the Syrian side of the border. Typically in Iraq, the U.S. is actually backing and training these Shia militias. There's a very funny tweet out by Dan McKnight, Bring Our Troops Home.us, which is a great veterans group angling to get the U.S. troops and then bring them home and end the forever wars, pointing out that the U.S. had carried out strikes essentially against groups that otherwise it would, in a different scenario, be training in years before, backing in the fight against the Islamic State. So this is, I think, Biden actually escalating a war here, carrying out these strikes against the Shia militias in Syria. It's not unheard of for maybe Israel to do that, but for the U.S. to carry out those strikes is notable. Also, just a reminder that when we kicked off last year, 2020, there was the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. Some of what escalated to the point the U.S. assassinated that general was Israeli strikes against these kind of groups in eastern Syria. And so that's certainly something that we have to worry about, that we enter into an escalatory cycle here. But Pat, I think that's all I have for today's show. Thank you so much for returning. Tell people where they could find your work, where they could support you, and also mention the new YouTube alternative that we're using, Library.
Oh, yes. I love Library. It's my favorite platform now. I would prefer folks to watch us on there. Basically, Library is a decentralized YouTube evolution. It's not an alternative. It's an evolution. It's based on the blockchain. It's made by Free State Project folks. It actually allows you to purchase content or tip folks, your favorite content creators, with LBC, which is a cryptocurrency that is like doubled in value in the last couple months. And so you can get that for free just by using the site. You can use it to tip your favorite content creators. That's at least mine is libertyweekly.net/LBRY, or you can go there and search us. I'm sure links will be in the show notes page as well. And let's see, I wanted to ask you though, Kyle, before we go, is this, has Israel also been stepping up their aggression in Syria?
So they have been carrying out airstrikes in Syria throughout the Biden administration. Was about a month of that so far, and probably even in the last weeks of the Trump administration. About once a week, they're bombing in or around Damascus, claiming that they're trying to hit Iranian bad targets and stuff like that. I don't know if I would say they've stepped up, but they definitely continue consistent aggression in Syria throughout the Biden administration. And so, but I haven't read of any attacks specifically in this area of Syria, which borders Iraq. So, yeah.
Okay. And and other than that, I wanted to close on the China bit just by saying, I think that people that we trust, people I trust, I have trusted in the past, Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski, just because they're independent media and they're reporting on things doesn't mean that they don't get things wrong sometimes. And I think folks are easier to believe, sources that they trust. I would encourage everyone to check for themselves. Check what we're saying for yourselves. Look at the stories yourself. Come to your own opinion. This is our commentary on it and what we think. But I think, free thinking individuals is the way to combat this and really get to the truth of the matter. So you can find my work at libertyweekly.net. That's your one-stop shop. I really appreciate being on your show again, Kyle. It's great to see you, man.
All right, thanks so much for coming back on, Pat. I'm at Kyle Lanslone _ on Twitter. On Twitter and on Facebook, me and Will Porter are doing a ton of work to push out more content, short clips of the show, Twitter threads, stuff like that. So please check out the Twitter and Facebook pages. We really need people to get on there and start sharing and liking content. Facebook and Twitter really want to charge us money to do that, but since we're a low budget show, one of the ways y'all could really help us out is by, rather than making us pay Facebook to do it, you could just share it and put it on your feed and put it in front of more people. So liking, sharing the show, go YouTube, again, Library, we're all set up over there now, and any way you can support the show, I really appreciate it. And Pat, once again, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks, bud.